boy had never seen a real wolf. The father hadn't smiled since his wife died in a wildfire. The house was quiet. The woods were watching. And a single trail of blood in the snow began a journey no one planned for. First came the bread crust. Then came the blanket. Then the toy car. Each morning, something disappeared from the doorstep. Each evening, a pair of golden eyes watched from the trees. Before we begin this unforgettable story, would you mind sharing where you're from in the comments? And if stories of love, loyalty, and second chances move you, please give this video a like and consider subscribing. The wind howled down the frozen valley of Bitterroot, Montana, sending needles of snow scratching across the roof of a lonely wooden cabin perched just before the line where the forest thickened into shadow. December had arrived without mercy. At dusk, the horizon turned the color of bruised fruit, and the trees stood solemn like ancient mourners wrapped in frost. Inside that cabin, 5-year-old Caleb Moore pressed his tiny fingers against the window pane, breath fogging the glass as he stared into the white blur beyond. Caleb was a pale, slender child with curly chestnut hair and soft brown eyes too serious for his age. Since the death of his mother a year ago, he had learned how to sit quietly for long stretches, how to whisper to shadows, and how to pretend that he didn't hear his father crying in his sleep. His father, Ethan Moore, was a man built like the mountains he once worked to protect. Tall, broad-shouldered, and calloused from years of firefighting in the wildlands. At 39, his face bore the rugged stamp of smoke and ash, with deep lines etched into the corners of his eyes, and a neatly trimmed beard peppered with early gray, since Sarah died in a forest blaze, caught under a falling tree while evacuating a group of hikers. Ethan had withdrawn from the world like a shuttered house. He now spent his days splitting wood, repairing the old furnace, and avoiding the weight of grief that seemed to hang in the rafters. He loved Caleb fiercely but struggled to connect. Words between them were often few, like snowflakes falling too far apart to settle together. That night, the fire cracked in the hearth while Ethan sipped bitter black coffee, seated in silence with only the dog-eared pages of a weathered fire journal for company. Caleb, meanwhile, watched the storm, and that's when he saw it. At first, he thought it was just the wind pushing shadows across the yard. But then the shape moved, slumped, deliberate, heavy, a large figure, limping through the storm like a ghost, as it neared the cabin's front porch light. Caleb's breath caught in his throat. It was a wolf, not the kind from fairy tales, not snarling or monstrous, but real, worn, ragged, and shivering. Its fur, once likely thick and silver gray, was matted with ice and streaked with dirt. One of its front paws barely touched the ground, and its amber eyes gleamed with something that startled Caleb. Not fear, not aggression, but exhaustion, suffering, a kind of silent plea. The wolf collapsed just short of the porch, body curling in on itself. Caleb's small hand flattened against the glass. "Dad," he whispered, "there's a dog out there." Ethan rose instantly. Stepping toward the door, he grabbed the rifle above the frame, not with violence in mind but instinct, shaped by years of living on the edge of the wild, peering out. He froze. "That's not a dog," he said quietly. "That's a wolf. Go to your room." "Caleb." Caleb hesitated. "He's hurt." I said, "Go." The boy obeyed, but he didn't sleep, while Ethan stood at the window, watching the wolf with uncertain eyes. Caleb crept to his closet and pulled out a small, worn blanket, the one his mother had knitted during her hospital shift breaks. Then he tiptoed to the kitchen, snatched a heel of bread from the pantry, and waited until the house fell silent again. Outside, the storm had calmed, but the cold bit sharper than ever. Caleb unlocked the front door as quietly as a 5-year-old could and stepped barefoot onto the porch. The world was hushed. No wind, no birds, just the faint sound of the wolf's breath. Caleb inched forward, placed the bread and blanket on the step, then backed inside and locked the door again, unnoticed. He dreamt that night of the wolf curled beside him, sharing warmth beneath that old blue blanket. By morning, the sky had cleared to a brittle blue. Ethan rose early, as always, and when he opened the front door to fetch wood, he paused. "Caleb," he called, his voice sharp, confused. The boy came running. There, on the snow-blanketed porch, the bread was gone, the blanket, too, in its place. A trail of prints, deep and staggered, led toward the tree line. A faint smear of blood marked where the wolf had limped. Ethan knelt beside the tracks, brushing snow from a faint indentation in the wood. The edge of the blanket, snagged on a nail, told him the rest. "You went outside, didn't you?" he asked without turning. Caleb's voice was small. He was cold. Ethan closed his eyes. "You can't do that again. Wolves aren't pets. They're wild, dangerous." But he didn't look dangerous. Caleb insisted. He looked lonely. Ethan didn't answer. He just stared at the prints leading into the woods, his mind unspooling old memories of smoke, ash, and loss. That night, as snow began to fall again, he dreamt of Sarah, her voice rising through the trees like a warning and a blessing. Each morning in Bitterroot felt a little colder than the last, as if the earth were exhaling its final breath before winter swallowed it whole. The cabin sat quietly under a shroud of frost, its chimney streaming a thin column of smoke that curled and vanished into a pearl-gray sky. Inside, Caleb Moore stirred in his small bed, his arms wrapped around a stuffed fox missing one eye, its fur worn thin where his tiny fingers clutched it nightly. He blinked awake, already thinking of the snow outside, of the wolf, of the silence that spoke louder than any bedtime story his father never told. The front door creaked open just after dawn. Caleb, bundled in an oversized flannel shirt that had once belonged to his mother, tiptoed outside while Ethan snored softly in the other room. The snow crunched lightly beneath his boots as he placed a few small items on the porch. 2 crumbling graham crackers, a green toy pickup truck with one missing wheel, and a folded yellow handkerchief with embroidered stars on the corner. His favorite. But he thought the wolf might need it more. He arranged them carefully in a row, then whispered, "Come back." Okay, before retreating into the warmth. By the time Ethan emerged, coffee in hand, the snow had been disturbed, the crackers were gone, the toy missing, and the handkerchief dragged several feet away, stained faintly with something dark. He frowned, not because he feared the wolf, not yet, but because he could see the way Caleb's eyes brightened each morning, searching the porch not for Santa Claus or squirrels, but for signs that something wild had accepted his offering. Later that day, as Caleb sketched the wolf in his notebook, short strokes for the fur, big eyes that looked sad. Not scary, Ethan laced up his boots. "I'm going to the ridge," he said without looking up. "Check on the trail." Caleb didn't answer. He rarely asked to come, knowing his father preferred the solitude of trees. Ethan grabbed his old field pack, slung his rifle over one shoulder, and stepped out into the biting wind. He followed the wolf's tracks. They were fresher than he expected, more erratic, curving northward toward the dense part of the forest that hadn't yet been claimed by the new access road. That road, a crude, muddy scar carved through the pines, had been the project of a developer named Russell Hale. A squat, bullish man in his 50s with a voice like gravel and little patience for environmental regulation. Hale Construction had brought in bulldozers without permits, tearing down trees and leveling brush in the name of future cabins and future tax revenue, and every old-timer in town hated it, Ethan most of all. He trudged through the thickets, jaw clenched, eyes scanning for movement. The tracks led past the edge of the disturbed area, into a narrow clearing he recognized from a controlled burn years ago. But something new caught his eye, twisted metal glinting in the snow. A trap. Illegal. Teeth sharp and crusted with old blood. Nearby. A faint rust-colored smear traced across the white. Barely visible unless you were looking. He crouched, brushing snow aside. The trail continued, limp, drag, limp, toward a cluster of birches. "Damn it," Ethan muttered under his breath. Standing. Someone had been setting snares where no one was supposed to. And the wolf, this ghost, as Caleb had named him in his drawings, was limping for a reason. He pulled out his old flip phone, but there was no signal, not this deep, back at the cabin. Caleb waited by the window, his breath fogging the glass. His drawing now included a second wolf beside Ghost, smaller, with big, round ears and a smile, a friend. He hadn't seen one, not really, but he thought maybe if he drew it, Ghost might find someone, might feel less alone. Night fell quietly. Snow came again, fine and persistent, like ash from an invisible fire. Caleb placed more gifts on the porch, a half cookie and a wool mitten. He waited beside the window long after bedtime, eyes scanning the dark. It was nearly midnight when he saw him. Ghost stood not at the steps, but several feet away, half silhouetted against the moonlit yard. The snow around him glowed faintly. His head was tilted slightly, as if listening. One front leg stayed raised, still tender. He made no move toward the house. He didn't growl, didn't howl, just watched. And Caleb, with a small hand pressed to the window, whispered, "Are you lonely too?" Ghost blinked once, then turned slowly and limped away, vanishing into the trees, inside his dreams that night. Caleb wasn't alone. He walked a forest path, his hand resting on Ghost's back. The trees whispered names he didn't know. Ahead, his mother stood in a dress of autumn leaves, smiling as if she'd been waiting. That same night, Ethan dreamt too, but his dreams were darker. He stood amid a wildfire, trees exploding into flames, the sky roaring like a wounded animal. Through the smoke, Sarah appeared, not screaming, not burning, but calm. She reached toward him and said, "Let the boy show you how to believe again." He woke at dawn, sweating, heart racing, in the silence. He heard the creak of floorboards and rose to find Caleb asleep beside the window, wrapped in a blanket, drawings scattered around him. Ethan picked one up. It was the wolf again, but this time, the wolf sat beside a little boy under a tree. The boy was smiling. So was the wolf. The wind clawed at the cabin walls like some unseen beast as night fell hard on Bitterroot. Trees creaked and bent beneath invisible hands, and the sky churned with low clouds that threatened snow but gave none. Just cold, deep and gnawing, inside the cabin. The fire had burned down to embers, casting the room in a flickering glow. Ethan Moore lay on the couch, one arm draped over his eyes, half asleep but never fully resting. The radio crackled softly on a nearby shelf, playing an old folk song he couldn't remember the name of. Upstairs, Caleb's door was cracked slightly, enough to hear his quiet breathing. At least, that's what Ethan thought. But Caleb was not in bed. Wrapped in 2 layers of pajamas and the navy blue coat that once belonged to his cousin. Caleb had tiptoed down the stairs with the skill of practiced stealth. He wore boots 3 sizes too big, stuffed with socks, and carried a flashlight shaped like a shark. The porch moaned as he stepped out, but the wind covered the sound. He closed the door behind him with care and turned toward the trees. Fresh snow had fallen earlier in the day, a thin layer atop the older, frozen crust. It preserved every footprint like a secret. Caleb followed them, ghostly impressions leading away from the house, looping toward the western ridge before bending north again. His breath fogged with each step, and his mittened hands clutched the flashlight like a compass. The dark was less frightening now. He imagined Ghost somewhere ahead, waiting. The boy had walked nearly half a mile when he heard it. A low whimper, sharp and broken, carried on the wind like the cry of a trapped thing. Caleb stopped, shined his light through the darkness. There, just beyond a cluster of moss-covered boulders, he saw a shape, curled, trembling, Ghost. The wolf lay against the stone, his side heaving. One of his front legs was twisted beneath him, caught in something gleaming dully in the moonlight. A trap, not like the ones in books or cartoons. This was iron, brutal, with jagged teeth and a long chain bolted to a nearby stake driven deep into the frozen ground. Blood stained the snow, dark and heavy around the animal. Caleb gasped. He stepped forward slowly, murmuring, "It's okay, it's just me. I brought you cookies. Remember, Ghost didn't growl, didn't move. His ears twitched weakly, but his eyes barely opened." Caleb dropped to his knees. Reaching out with shaking fingers, he touched the wolf's shoulder gently, then sat beside him, wrapping both arms around the thick, matted fur. The wolf gave a low sound, not pain, but something else. Surrender. And then, in a gesture no book could explain, Ghost lowered his head and pressed it into Caleb's small chest. Back at the cabin, the wind knocked something off the porch, an old lantern, and the crash snapped Ethan upright. He looked toward the stairs. Caleb. No answer. He climbed quickly. The bed was empty, the window slightly open. His heart turned cold. He grabbed his parka, flashlight, and rifle, shoving his boots on without socks. He didn't bother with gloves. The wind tore at his coat as he ran down the steps and into the woods, calling his son's name into the dark. It took him 20 minutes to find them. Ethan's flashlight beam caught the shape of his son first, curled beside a mass of fur and blood. "Caleb!" he roared, half in terror, half in disbelief. He stumbled through the drifts toward them, slipping once when he reached them. Caleb didn't flinch. "He's hurt," the boy whispered. "I think he needs us." Ethan looked down. The wolf's leg was caught clean through, the metal biting deep into muscle and bone. The smell of blood was sharp, feral. He'd seen wounds like this before, in deer, foxes, even dogs, but never this close. Never on a creature so wild and still so trusting. Ghost's eyes flicked toward him, but held no threat. Only pain. "I need you to back up, Bud," Ethan said softly. Caleb nodded and moved aside, rubbing his arms for warmth. Ethan dropped to one knee, inspecting the trap. He reached into his coat and pulled out a multi-tool. "This is going to hurt him. Might scare you, but I need you to be brave. Okay?" Caleb nodded, eyes wide, with a grunt. Ethan wedged the tool between the trap's jaws and pried. The metal screamed in protest. Ghost growled, not at Ethan, but at the pain, and thrashed once. The jaws sprang open. The wolf's leg fell limp. Blood poured freely. Ethan pressed a folded bandana to the wound. "We have to get him out of here. He won't survive the night. How we carry him." The next 15 minutes were a blur. Ethan wrapped the wolf's body in his parka and hoisted him into his arms with a strength born of desperation. The animal was heavy, over 90 pounds, he guessed. But Ethan held tight. Caleb walked beside him, holding the shark-shaped flashlight aloft like a talisman. By the time they reached the cabin, the wind had eased. Ethan kicked open the door to the old woodshed and laid Ghost on a pile of burlap sacks. He fetched a basin of warm water and his emergency kit from the closet. His hands worked automatically, cleaning, dressing, binding. He hadn't done this in years. Not since the puppy. It had been over a decade ago. He'd found the stray under a collapsed barn near Missoula. Skinny, shaking, starving. He brought it to a vet clinic on the edge of town. That's where he met Sarah. She had been 26, tall and lean, with auburn hair always tied up in a knot that came loose whenever she got excited. Her hands smelled of antiseptic and lavender. She was fearless with animals, soft-spoken with people, and had a laugh that could melt snow. She'd helped him save that puppy. And in turn, she'd saved him. Ethan sat now beside another wounded creature, and across the years he felt her presence like a hand on his shoulder. He looked at Caleb, who had fallen asleep beside the wolf, his head resting lightly on Ghost's ribs. Ghost didn't move, didn't growl, only breathed, slow and steady. Ethan whispered, "You picked one hell of a guardian, kid." The week that followed passed like a dream half-remembered. Quiet, soft, and unlike any Caleb had ever known. The woodshed. Once nothing more than a dusty outbuilding for tools and kindling, had become something sacred inside. The wounded wolf rested on layers of old burlap and wool blankets, his eyes alert but no longer filled with pain. Caleb came to him every day after breakfast, with crackers in his pockets and stories in his hands, Ghost, as Caleb still called him. Never moved much, not yet, but he listened. The wolf would lift his head slightly when Caleb spoke, or let out a soft huff of air when the boy read his favorite picture book, the one with a bear that wore a yellow scarf and never gave up. Sometimes Caleb drew pictures beside him, sketches of pine trees, little wolves, or Caleb himself with Ghost by his side. The sketches were crude, but there was feeling in every line. Ethan watched from a distance at first, through the window, from the edge of the doorway. He brought meat, boiled rice, clean bandages, but mostly. He watched Caleb, not the wolf, and he saw something in his son he hadn't noticed for months. Peace, focus, a strange sort of joy. Ghost's leg began to heal slowly. The bleeding stopped. The swelling eased. He no longer whimpered when shifting, and though he never barked or growled, his eyes followed Caleb like a silent guardian. Once, Ethan opened the shed door too quickly. Startling Caleb, Ghost had risen, a deep rumble echoing in his chest. Only when Ethan raised his hands and backed up did the wolf settle again. There was loyalty in that gesture and warning. One night, the temperature dropped sharply, and a brittle stillness fell across the forest. Ethan stoked the fire high and gave Caleb a mug of warm milk before bed. But the boy refused to sleep in his room. "Just tonight," he said, curling up on a sleeping bag near the woodshed door. "In case he gets scared." Ethan didn't argue. It was well past midnight when it happened. A long, low howl rose into the sky like a ribbon of wind, rich and mournful. Caleb sat up instantly, from deep within the trees. 3 more howls answered, but these were softer, uncertain, trembling. Ethan had been awake, half reading one of Sarah's old journals, when he heard it. He grabbed his coat, slipped out the back, and crept toward the shed with a flashlight in hand. But he didn't need it. The moon had broken through the clouds, painting the yard silver blue. At the edge of the forest, 3 shapes emerged. The first was a female wolf, her ribs visible beneath her dull fur, eyes wary and wide behind her. 2 smaller wolves, pups barely old enough to be on their own, shuffled and shivered, stepping hesitantly on the frost-crusted grass. The mother stopped first. The pups clung to her legs. All 3 stared toward the shed. Inside, Ghost stood for the first time in days. His body trembled, but his head was high. He pushed the door open with his nose. Caleb stood beside him, tiny fingers buried in the thick fur of Ghost's neck. Ethan watched, heart lodged in his throat. Ghost stepped forward. Slowly. He limped, but made no sound. He crossed the yard and measured steps until he reached the other wolf. They stood there, nose to nose, unmoving. Then, gently, Ghost touched his muzzle to the mother's forehead. Licked it once. She whimpered, an almost human sound, and lowered her head. The pups crept forward, circling his legs, sniffing with cautious joy. It was not dominance, it was recognition, Caleb whispered. He brought his family. Ethan backed away, slowly. He didn't want to break the moment, but inside, something was shifting. This wasn't just a wounded animal. This was something deeper, older. A language he didn't understand but could finally feel. The next morning, Ethan made a call he hadn't made in years. He contacted the Montana Department of Fish, Wildlife and Parks, and asked to speak to someone from Wildlife Conservation. The woman who returned the call 2 hours later introduced herself as Danielle Carter. She was in her late 30s, with a brisk voice and calm demeanor, used to run field studies up near Flathead Lake. She said, "Now I'm based in Missoula. Your message said you have a situation involving wolves." "Yes." Ethan replied, "But it's different. I think you'd better come see." She arrived the next day, in a dusty, government-issued SUV, wearing a fleece jacket embroidered with the state logo and carrying a notepad in one hand. Danielle was of medium height, with short auburn hair pulled back into a no-nonsense ponytail. Her boots were caked with old mud, and she moved like someone who'd spent more time in the woods than behind a desk. Ethan brought her to the edge of the shed and let her watch. Caleb sat outside with Ghost lying at his feet. The other wolves, though skittish, remained in sight, never approaching too close, but never fleeing either. Danielle watched in silence for a long time when she finally spoke. Her voice was soft. "That's not normal behavior, I know. You said the wolf was injured." "Yes. Caught in a trap near the northern ridge. Illegal," she said flatly. "We've had reports of that, and if the rest of the pack came down this close to humans, they didn't come down," Ethan corrected. "He called them. They came to him." She nodded, scribbling. But while Ethan opened doors to conservation, someone else was stirring a different pot. Word had spread, via a loose-lipped neighbor at the general store, that wolves had been seen near the Moore property. Stories changed quickly. Some said wolves were circling homes. Others claimed a child had been approached in broad daylight. None were true, but fear is a fire that needs no kindling. Within 2 days, a group of locals had begun patrolling the woods behind the cabin. They carried hunting rifles, wore camo gear, and muttered phrases like, "Protect our own," and "It's only a matter of time." The unofficial leader was Tom Prodder, a man in his 60s with a thick red beard, sour breath, and a long-standing grudge against anything with teeth. "Yaoi, we let one get too close." He warned others at the gas station, "It's gonna bring the whole damn pack." By the time Ethan heard about the group, it was too late to keep things quiet. He watched one evening from the back window as 3 figures in blaze-orange vests paced along the edge of his land, rifles slung low. Caleb didn't see them. He was drawing Ghost again, this time with the 2 pups curled beside him. Ethan knew things were coming to a head. The morning was heavy with frost, a brittle stillness clinging to every pine needle and rooftop shingle. Bitterroot Valley was holding its breath. Snow lay undisturbed over the yard and woodshed, except for the delicate tracks that hinted at the quiet lives moving within. Inside the cabin. Ethan stood at the window with a mug of coffee gone cold in his hand, his eyes scanning the edge of the woods. Caleb was outside already, bundled in his blue coat, sitting cross-legged beside Ghost, who rested like a dark sentinel behind them, in the shadows beyond the shed. The rest of the pack lingered, 5 wolves now. The gaunt mother and her 2 pups joined by a second adult female and a lanky, cinnamon-colored male with a missing ear. Each had their own posture, their own silent code of movement, but all deferred to Ghost, and to the boy who somehow became their bridge. It should have been impossible. Ethan turned from the window and glanced toward the small desk in the corner of the cabin where Sarah's notebooks had been gathered. He hadn't opened them all yet. Just the one where she had jotted ideas about wildlife behavior and coexistence between species. The notes were messy, hopeful, full of question marks. She had believed animals could form relationships with people if fear wasn't the first language. And somehow, through their son, her theory had found proof. Then came the sound. Engines. Multiple. Ethan's gut dropped. He opened the front door and stepped onto the porch. 3 ATVs tore up the snow-covered trail, their headlights flickering between branches like fireflies gone mad. Tom Protter led the charge, dressed in full camouflage with a red bandana tied around his thick neck. Behind him were 2 other men, Doug, a retired mechanic with a limp and a temper, and Frank, a younger man known for always carrying more ammunition than necessary. The 3 of them parked haphazardly and dismounted, rifles slung and eyes hard. Ethan walked toward them slowly, arms out. "You need to turn around," he said, voice low but firm. Tom spat into the snow. "Too late for that. You've got a whole damn pack nesting in your backyard. We heard them howling for miles. It's a threat. They're not a threat. They're staying out of sight." "No one's been hurt," Frank muttered. "Yet, we're not going to wait until a kid disappears." "More," Doug added, raising his gun slightly for emphasis. That's when the cabin door burst open and Caleb came running, breath white in the cold air, his small boots crunching over frost. He ran straight past his father, past the hunters, and stopped in front of the shed. Ghost had stepped halfway into the light, his ears back, his body rigid. Caleb threw his arms around the wolf's neck. "He's not a monster," he shouted, voice cracking, but strong. "He's my friend." The hunters froze. Doug lowered his rifle a hair. Frank looked uncomfortable, but Tom didn't blink. Then another voice broke the tension. Sharp, female, and commanding, "Put your weapons down, now." All heads turned as a government-marked SUV pulled up along the trail, snow kicking up behind its tires. A tall woman in a dark Forest Service uniform stepped out and approached. Her name was Rebecca Quinn, a field ranger in her early 40s with a lean frame, piercing hazel eyes, and dark brown hair tied into a tidy braid that disappeared beneath her collar. Years in the field had made her quick, precise, and unshakable. Her face was lined with sun and stress, but she carried herself like a general. "I said, put them down," she repeated, stepping between Ethan and the hunters. "This area is now under investigation by Montana Fish." wildlife, and parks. Tom bristled. "You got no right to tell us." "I have every right," she snapped. "You're on private property, armed, threatening civilians. And," she added, gesturing to the woodshed, interfering with an active wildlife observation. A second SUV arrived behind hers. From it stepped Danielle Carter, the conservationist who had first responded to Ethan's call, followed by two more researchers, one holding a large camera, the other a field tablet. "What the hell is this?" Tom muttered. Backing up. "A miracle," Danielle said simply, staring past them. Ghost had stepped forward now, fully into the open, behind him. One by one, the other 4 wolves emerged, forming a semicircle in the snow. They stood shoulder to shoulder, silent and still. Then, without cue, Ghost lifted his head and released a long, resonant howl, deep, melodic, not threatening but filled with layered emotion. One by one, the other wolves joined him, their heads tilted skyward, their bodies poised in solemn formation. Then it happened. All 5 wolves lowered their heads in unison and bowed, forelegs extended, muzzles low to the ground, eyes shut or half closed. It was not a show of submission, it was something older, something sacred. A gesture that made everyone, Ethan, the hunters, the researchers, go still. Caleb whispered. "They're saying thank you." Tom looked visibly shaken. Doug shifted uncomfortably. Frank slowly lowered his rifle. Rebecca stepped forward. "Everyone needs to leave. Now. This area is being formally designated for emergency protection status pending further review." Tom grumbled something but retreated with the others, leaving tracks in the snow and tension in the air. Later that day, inside the cabin, Ethan and Caleb sat at the kitchen table, while Rebecca reviewed paperwork and field data. Danielle showed them a digital map. "We've proposed a mini wildlife corridor here," she said, pointing. "Linked to the nearby preserve, full protection, no hunting, no trapping, monitored movement. It's never been done in this region before. And we'd like you both involved," Rebecca added. "As consultants, you've done what no one else has, built trust." Caleb blinked. "Even me, especially you," she smiled. "They're calling you the boy who spoke wolf. Sometimes, the most powerful voices are not the ones that speak, but the ones that trust in silence, in the frozen forests of Bitterroot. A wounded wolf, a grieving father, and an innocent child found one another, not through words, but through grace. What happened between Caleb and Ghost wasn't just a bond between a boy and a wild animal, it was a miracle, a quiet, holy moment where creation met compassion, and something sacred passed between them. Perhaps it was no accident that a child, pure in heart, was the one chosen to be heard. After all, in the book of Isaiah, it is written, "The wolf shall dwell with the lamb, and a little child shall lead them," in a world so full of noise and fear. Caleb reminded us that faith begins where fear ends, and that sometimes all it takes is one gentle soul to change the hearts of many. Let this story be more than just a memory. Let it be a prayer for the animals who still wait to be understood, a prayer for the children who see what we often overlook, a prayer for every heart that has been broken but still dares to open again. If this story moved you, if you believe in second chances, in healing, in miracles that begin with love, leave a comment below and type Amen to let the world know that you still believe. Share this story with someone who needs a little light. Subscribe to our channel for more stories of hope and redemption. And may God bless you and your loved ones, now and always.